Watch the man in white head wrap lighting the book pile. His name is Asif. He just ignited religious texts while fellow protesters celebrate around him. Then, sudden supernatural wind strikes during clear weather, extinguishing all flames instantly and leaving everyone stunned.
My name is Asif. I'm 32 years old, and on May 8th, 2019, I led a group to burn Bibles in our city plaza. I was a devout Muslim who believed I was defending my faith against Christian missionaries. What happened next changed everything I believed about God, faith, and my own heart forever. I was born into a world where faith wasn't just belief, it was identity. My father served as imam at our local mosque, a respected man whose voice carried weight in our conservative neighborhood. From the moment I could walk, I was taught that Islam was not just my religion, but my fortress against a world that wanted to destroy everything we held sacred. My father would gather us children around him after evening prayers, his withered hands gesturing as he spoke about the threats facing our community. Son, he would say, his eyes intense with conviction, they want to steal our children's souls. The Christians come with smiles and gifts, but their true purpose is to turn our young people away from Allah. These words weren't spoken with hatred, but with the deep concern of a father protecting his family. In our household, Christianity wasn't just a different religion, it was presented as a direct assault on everything we believed and everyone we loved. Growing up, I absorbed these teachings like water soaking into dry earth. I watched my father's devotion during his 5 daily prayers, saw how he treated the Quran with reverence that bordered on fear, and learned that defending our faith was not optional but essential. My mother would tell stories of Muslim families torn apart by conversion, of children who abandoned their parents for foreign beliefs. And these weren't abstract concepts to me, they were real dangers that required vigilance and action. Our neighborhood had always been predominantly Muslim, with families who had lived there for generations. We knew each other's children, shared meals during Ramadan, and supported one another through life's challenges. It was a tight knit community where Islamic values weren't just practiced but lived out in daily interactions. The call to prayer echoed through our streets 5 times a day, and Friday gatherings at the mosque were community events where business was conducted and relationships were strengthened. But in recent months, everything had begun to change. A new church had been constructed just 2 blocks from our mosque, a modern building with a tall cross that seemed to tower over our traditional minaret. The church brought with it something we had never experienced before: organized Christian missionary activities targeting our area specifically. Young people began appearing on street corners, holding small gatherings in the park, and visiting homes with literature about Jesus Christ. At first, the elders in our community tried to ignore these developments, hoping the missionaries would eventually move on to other areas, but the activities intensified rather than diminished. Stories began circulating about Muslim youth attending these gatherings, accepting invitations to church services, and some even converting to Christianity. Each story sent shockwaves through our community, creating an atmosphere of fear and urgency that I had never experienced before. The breaking point came when we learned that 3 young people from our own neighborhood had publicly converted to Christianity. These weren't strangers or troublemakers, but children from respected families who had been raised in our mosque. One of them was the son of a family friend, a boy I had known since childhood, who had always been devout in his Islamic practice. His conversion felt like a personal betrayal, not just to his family, but to our entire community. Community meetings became more frequent and more intense. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the need for action, about protecting our remaining youth from what they saw as spiritual predators. My father came home from these meetings with a heaviness I had never seen before. His usual confidence seemed shaken, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. The foundation of our world was cracking, and we could all feel it. I remember the night my father called me into his study, the same room where he had taught me to read Arabic as a child. The walls were lined with Islamic texts, and the scent of incense filled the air. He sat behind his desk, looking older than his 55 years, and spoke words that would change the trajectory of my life. Asif, he said, his voice heavy with responsibility, Allah has given you strength and conviction that many young men lack. Our community needs leaders who will stand up for what is right. He paused, studying my face carefully. The elders have been discussing the situation with these Christians. Something must be done to show them that we will not allow our faith to be attacked without consequences. The weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a mantle I had been preparing to wear my entire life. This wasn't just a request from my father, it was a calling from my community, a test of my devotion to Allah. I felt a surge of purpose that I had never experienced before, a clarity of mission that seemed to burn in my chest. Everything I had been taught, every lesson about defending the faith, every story about Muslim warriors throughout history, it all converged in that moment. I truly believed I was doing Allah's work by stopping these Christians. This wasn't anger or hatred driving me, it was love. Love for my family, my community, my faith, and my God. In my mind, those who would steal souls from Allah deserved whatever resistance we could mount. I saw myself as a defender, a guardian standing between my people and those who would lead them astray. Over the following weeks, I began reaching out to other young Muslim men in our community. I found them dealing with the same fears and frustrations that consumed me. We met informally at first, sharing our concerns over tea after evening prayers, but gradually these conversations became more organized, more focused on action rather than just discussion. The group grew to include 15 dedicated young men, all of us united by a shared conviction that our faith was under siege. We told ourselves we were modern day mujahideen, holy warriors called to defend Islam against its enemies. In our minds, we weren't planning violence or hatred, we were planning protection and preservation. We convinced ourselves that dramatic action was necessary to send a message that our community would not be passive victims of spiritual colonization. Looking back now, I can see how fear had twisted our love into something dangerous. We had allowed our devotion to become defensiveness, our protection to become aggression. But at the time everything felt righteous and necessary, I was completely convinced that Allah was calling me to lead this resistance, and I was ready to answer that call with everything I had. The basement of our community center became our secret sanctuary, a place where 15 young Muslim men would gather twice a week to plan what we believed was our holy mission. The room smelled of old carpets and the lingering aroma of the meals served upstairs during community events. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on our faces as we huddled around a small wooden table that had seen better days. My older brother was the one who first suggested burning Christian materials as our form of symbolic protest. He was 28, married with two children, and worked as a mechanic in the city. Unlike me, he had seen more of the world beyond our neighborhood, and his anger seemed more focused, more strategic. When he spoke, the rest of us listened with the respect reserved for someone who had earned his place through experience rather than just enthusiasm. Brothers, he said during one of our evening meetings, his calloused hands spread flat on the table. We need to send a message that cannot be misunderstood. Words have failed, peaceful protests have been ignored. They continue their activities in our neighborhood as if we don't exist. His voice carried a conviction that made my chest tighten with anticipation. But fire speaks a language everyone understands. The idea of burning Bibles felt both terrifying and absolutely right to me. In Islamic teaching, all books of revelation deserve respect, even those we believe have been corrupted. But my older brother explained that these weren't just books, they were weapons being used against our community. When someone uses a sword against you, he said, you don't respect the sword, you destroy it. We began collecting Bibles systematically, like soldiers gathering intelligence on enemy positions. I volunteered to visit the local Christian bookstore, my heart pounding as I approached the counter with an armload of different Bible translations. The elderly Christian woman behind the counter smiled warmly as she only rung up my purchase, asking if they were gifts for friends. I managed to nod and mumble something about studying comparative religion, hating myself for the deception, but telling myself it was necessary for the greater good. Other members of our group obtained Bibles through different means. My younger cousin, who worked as a janitor at the nearby Christian church, was able to take several copies that had been left in the donation bin. Another brother had a Christian co-worker who had given him a Bible months earlier in an attempt to share his faith. Each Bible we collected felt like a small victory, evidence that we were taking concrete action rather than just talking about problems. We told ourselves this was jihad, holy struggle for our faith. But even as we used that sacred word, something deep inside me whispered that this was wrong. The feeling grew stronger each time we met. Each time we planned another aspect of our demonstration, I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to silence the voice in my heart that questioned our methods. The internal conflict became more intense as May 8th approached. I would catch myself remembering small kindnesses from Christian neighbors over the years. There was the elderly Christian woman who had brought soup to our family when my mother was sick, asking for nothing in return. The Christian shopkeeper who had given my younger sister free candy when she didn't have enough money. The Christian teacher who had stayed after school to help me with mathematics, never once trying to discuss religion. These memories felt like betrayals of my mission, weaknesses that I needed to overcome rather than wisdom I should heed. I shared my doubts with my older brother during one of our private conversations, hoping he would help me find the strength to continue. Instead, he looked at me with disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. Asif, he said, his voice gentle but firm, this is exactly what they want. They show you small kindnesses to make you forget the larger threat they represent. Do you think the devil announces himself with horns and fire? He comes with smiles and gifts, just like these Christians. His words made sense to my confused mind, providing a framework to dismiss my growing doubts as spiritual weakness rather than moral clarity. The pressure from my family added another layer of complexity to my internal struggle. My father had made it clear that the community was watching to see how I would respond to this test of faith. My mother, usually so gentle and nurturing, had begun speaking with pride about her son, who was standing up for Islam. My younger siblings looked at me with admiration that I had never experienced before, seeing me as their protector and hero. The night before our planned demonstration, we held our final meeting in that basement room. The pile of Bibles sat in the center of our circle like an accusation, their covers reflecting the fluorescent light. Someone had brought gasoline in a red plastic container that reeked of fumes, even with the cup tightly closed. Matches were distributed to each member of the group, though I would be the one to light the fire as our chosen leader. As we discussed final logistics, I found my hands shaking slightly. I told myself it was excitement, anticipation of finally taking meaningful action for our faith, but deep down I knew it was fear. Not fear of the authorities or the Christian community, but fear that we were about to cross a line that would change us forever. I remember looking around at the faces of my brothers, seeing the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that I felt in my own heart. We prayed together before leaving that basement for the last time as the men we had been. Each of us asked Allah for strength and guidance, for protection and blessing on our mission. I remember my own prayer more clearly than any prayer I had ever offered before or since. I asked Allah to use me as His instrument to make me worthy of the trust my community had placed in me. I asked for courage to do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost to myself. Looking back now, I realize that Allah was indeed answering my prayer, just not in the way I expected. The morning of May 8th, 2019, I woke before dawn with my stomach twisted in knots. I performed my morning prayer with unusual intensity, begging Allah one final time to give me strength for what lay ahead. My hands were shaking as I picked up those matches, and I told myself it was the trembling of a warrior preparing for battle. I had no idea I was about to encounter the very God I thought I was fighting against. The morning of May 8th, 2019 dawned clear and bright, with not a single cloud visible in the expansive blue sky above our city. I remember standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the peaceful scene and feeling the weight of what we were about to do settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. The call to prayer echoed from our mosque's minaret, and I performed my ablutions with extra care, believing this might be the last time I prayed as an ordinary member of our community. After today, I would be known as someone who had taken action, someone who had stood up for our faith when it mattered most. By 10 in the morning, our group began gathering at the predetermined meeting point 3 blocks from the city plaza. We had chosen this location carefully, close enough to our target, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention during our final preparations. 10 of our original 15 members showed up, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and nervous energy that churned in my own stomach. The other 5 had backed out over the past few days, citing family obligations or work commitments, but I suspected they had lost their nerve. My older brother carried the red gasoline container, its contents sloshing ominously with each step. Another brother had the pile of Bibles wrapped in a blue tarp. about 25 books of various sizes and translations that we had collected over the past month. The weight of those books seemed symbolic to me, representing the spiritual burden we were about to lift from our community's shoulders. As we walked toward the plaza, I noticed the streets were busier than usual for Wednesday morning. Shopkeepers were opening their stores, children were walking to school, and the normal rhythm of city life continued around us as if this were any ordinary day. Part of me wanted to call off the demonstration, to blend back into this peaceful normalcy and pretend we had never planned such a dramatic gesture. But the expectations of my community, my family, and my own sense of religious duty drove me forward. The plaza where we had chosen to make our stand was a large open space in the center of our district, surrounded by shops, cafes, and the main road that connected our neighborhood to the rest of the city. A fountain sat in the center, no longer functional but still serving as a gathering point for various community activities. We had selected this location because of its visibility and symbolic importance as the heart of our neighborhood. When we arrived, we found that word of our demonstration had somehow spread. A small crowd of onlookers had already gathered around the edges of the plaza, including several faces I recognized from our mosque, and others I didn't know at all. Among them, I spotted a group of Christians, including the elderly woman from the bookstore where I had purchased some of our Bibles. Her face was marked with concern and sadness that made my stomach clench with unexpected guilt. Two police officers stood at a distance, watching our preparations with professional detachment. They made no move to intervene, and I later learned they had been instructed to monitor the situation but allow our demonstration to proceed unless it became violent or threatened public safety. Their presence added an official weight to our actions that made everything feel more real and more frightening. My hands trembled as I unwrapped the pile of Bibles and arranged them in the center of the plaza near the old fountain. Each book seemed heavier than it should have been, and I found myself handling them with more care than I had intended. These weren't just objects to be destroyed, they were symbols of beliefs that real people held sacred. For a moment, I imagined the faces of the people who had read these books, who had found comfort and guidance in their pages, and I had to force myself to remember why we were there. The other protesters formed a circle around me, some chanting traditional Islamic phrases, others simply standing in solidarity with our cause. Their voices created a rhythm that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat, building energy and momentum toward the moment when I would light the fire. I could feel the eyes of the crowd upon us, some supportive, others clearly opposed to what we were about to do. As I knelt beside the pile of Bibles, with the book of matches in my hand, I experienced a moment of crystalline clarity about what we were attempting. We weren't just burning books, we were making a statement about the incompatibility of our faiths, about the impossibility of coexistence, about the need for one truth to triumph over another. In that instant, I felt the full weight of centuries of religious conflict pressing down on this single moment. The Christian onlookers had moved closer, and I could hear some of them praying quietly, their voices mixing with our chanting in a strange harmony that seemed to fill the plaza with competing spiritual energies. An elderly Christian man stepped forward from their group, his weathered face creased with concern, and spoke directly to me. "Son," he said, his voice carrying across the space between us. "I don't know what we've done to hurt you, but surely there's a better way to solve this than destroying what others hold sacred." His words were gentle, without accusation or anger, and they hit me harder than any shouting or condemnation could have. I could see tears in an elderly Christian woman's eyes as she watched me prepare to destroy books that clearly meant as much to her as the Quran meant to me. For a moment that felt like an eternity, I hesitated with the matchbox in my hands. Every instinct in my body was telling me to stop, to find another way, to seek understanding rather than destruction. But the eyes of my brothers were upon me. The expectations of my community weighed on my shoulders, and my understanding of religious duty demanded action. I struck the first match, watching the small flame dance in the gentle morning breeze, and approached the pile of Bibles, with my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The flame touched the corner of the first Bible, and for a brief moment the pages began to blacken and curl. The other protesters cheered, their voices rising in celebration of this symbolic victory. But then something happened that I will never forget. Something that defied every law of nature I understood and challenged every belief I held about how the world worked. A wind unlike anything I had ever experienced suddenly swept across the plaza with such force that it knocked three of us backwards onto the hard pavement. But this wasn't an ordinary wind that affects everything in its path. My aunt, who had been standing just 20 feet away from us, later told me she felt absolutely nothing. No breeze at all. The wind seemed to have a precise target, affecting only the area immediately around the pile of Bibles, as if an invisible hand had reached down from heaven to protect those sacred pages. The flames that had just begun to spread across the Bible covers were extinguished instantly, not gradually as you would expect from a strong breeze, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. Even more bewildering, the pages that I had seen beginning to blacken and curl were suddenly pristine again, as if the fire had never touched them at all. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the Bibles appeared exactly as they had before I struck that first match. The temperature around the book pile dropped so dramatically that my breath became visible in small puffs of vapor, even though the rest of the plaza remained warm under this bright morning sun. Other protesters who had been standing near me began rubbing their arms and stepping back, confused by the sudden cold that seemed to emanate from the Bibles themselves. One of my brothers later described feeling like he had walked into a freezer, but only when he approached the center of our circle. I tried to convince myself that this was just a coincidence, a freak weather occurrence that had nothing to do with what we were attempting to do. With shaking hands, I struck another match and approached the pile again, determined to complete our mission. But as soon as the flame came within 2 feet of the Bibles, the same supernatural wind appeared, and this time even stronger, knocking the match from my fingers and sending me stumbling backward into my older brother. The crowd that had gathered to watch our demonstration was murmuring now, some pointing at the sky in confusion, others backing away from what they clearly recognized as something beyond natural explanation. I heard one of the police officers radio for backup, though I couldn't understand why at the time. Later, I learned that they had witnessed the same impossible phenomena that we had, and they wanted additional witnesses to confirm what they had seen. My hands were trembling uncontrollably now, not from cold or fear, but from something deeper that I couldn't name. I tried a third time to light the Bibles, and then a fourth, each attempt ending the same way. The matches would light normally in my hand, burn with a steady flame until I approached the books, and then be extinguished by winds that seemed to come from nowhere and affect nothing else in the plaza. By the fifth failed attempt, even my most dedicated brothers were backing away from me, their faces reflecting the same confusion and growing terror that I felt in my own heart. The supernatural protection of these books was undeniable, visible to everyone present, and it challenged everything we believed about our mission and our faith. How could Allah allow Christian books to be protected in this way? How could the God we served permit such an obvious miracle in defense of what we believed to be false teachings? But the most disturbing part wasn't the wind or the temperature change or even the restoration of the burned pages. The most disturbing part was what began happening inside my mind and heart as I knelt there in the plaza, surrounded by Bibles that refused to burn. A voice started speaking to me, not audibly like the voices of the people around me, but directly to my consciousness in a way that bypassed my ears entirely. The voice was gentle but unmistakable, filled with a love so profound that it made me want to weep, and an authority so absolute that I knew resistance was futile. It wasn't speaking Arabic, the language of my prayers, or even my native tongue, but somehow I understood every word with perfect clarity. The voice was calling my name, not with anger or condemnation, as I expected, but with the tenderness of a father welcoming home a long-lost son. Asif, the voice said, and in that single word I heard depths of meaning that would take a lifetime to fully understand. Why are you fighting against me? Why are you trying to destroy the words that speak of my love for you? The questions pierced through every defense I had built around my heart, every justification I had constructed for our actions, every conviction I had held about the rightness of our cause. In that moment, memories began flooding my mind. But they weren't my memories. I saw scenes of Jesus, he healing the sick, feeding the hungry, comforting the brokenhearted, and teaching about love and forgiveness. I saw him weeping over Jerusalem, not because the people had rejected his political authority, but because they had rejected his offer of peace. I saw him on a cross dying not for his own sins, but for the sins of the world, including mine. These visions came with such clarity and emotional force that I found myself gasping for breath, my worldview crumbling like a house built on sand, facing an unstoppable tide. Everything I had been taught about Jesus being merely a prophet, about Christianity being a corruption of true faith, about the need to fight against Christian influence, all of it dissolved in the face of this direct encounter with divine love. I realized in that transformative moment that I wasn't fighting against false religion or protecting true faith. I was fighting against the very God I claimed to serve, because the Allah I had worshipped and the Jesus I had rejected were the same divine being, reaching out to me through different names and different traditions, but with the same infinite love and mercy. The understanding hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself dropping to my knees, not in worship of my childhood faith, but in surrender to a truth larger than any single religious tradition. My hands, which had been shaking with determination to light those fires, were now shaking with the recognition of how close I had come to committing an act of spiritual violence against the very source of love and life. I looked up at the faces of my confused brothers, at the concerned Christians who had been praying for us, at the bewildered onlookers who had witnessed this impossible scene, and I knew that my life had been divided into two parts: everything before this moment and everything after. The man who had come to the plaza that morning to burn Bibles was gone forever, replaced by someone who was just beginning to understand what faith really meant. I found myself calling out to Jesus, asking for forgiveness, the words spilling from my lips before my mind could fully process what I was saying. Jesus, forgive me, I whispered at first, then louder as the reality of my situation became clear. Jesus, forgive us all for what we tried to do. The sound of his name on my lips felt both foreign and familiar, like returning to a home I had never known I was searching for. The remaining protesters stared at me in complete shock as I remained on my knees beside the pile of intact Bibles. My older brother approached cautiously, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. Asif, what are you doing? Get up. We need to try again. But I couldn't get up. Not yet. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, and standing felt impossible until I had processed what had just happened. We were wrong, I said, looking up at him with tears streaming down my face. Can't you see? We were fighting against God Himself. These books are protected because they contain His truth, His love for all people, including us. My words seemed to hang in the air like a foreign language that no one present could fully understand, including myself. Three of my brothers backed away immediately, their faces hardening with anger and disappointment. You've lost your mind, one of them spat. This is some kind of Christian trick, some kind of illusion they've created to confuse you. They gathered their things quickly and left the plaza, shaking their heads in disgust at what they saw as my betrayal of everything we stood for. But four others remained, their expressions thoughtful rather than angry. They had witnessed the same impossible events I had, felt the same supernatural wind, seen the same miraculous protection of the books we had tried to destroy. My younger cousin knelt beside me, his voice quiet and uncertain. Asif, what happened to you? What did you experience that we didn't? I tried to explain the voice, the visions, the overwhelming sense of divine love that had washed over me, but words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of what I had encountered. How do you describe the moment when everything you believed about reality gets turned upside down? How do you explain to people from your own faith tradition that you've just met the God they've been taught to view as a false deity? I heard Jesus calling my name. I said simply, not with anger for what we were trying to do, but with love, with forgiveness. He showed me that He's not our enemy, that He never was. We've been fighting against the very God we claim to serve. The words felt both true and impossible as they left my mouth. The small group of Christians who had been watching our demonstration from a distance began to approach us cautiously. The elderly woman from the bookstore was among them, her face wet with tears, but her expression one of joy rather than triumph. She knelt beside me and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, her voice soft and motherly. Son, we've been praying for you and your friends ever since we heard about your plans. We prayed that God would reveal His love to you, that He would show you His heart for all people. Her kindness in that moment, when she had every right to be angry with us for trying to destroy something sacred to her, was like another small miracle that confirmed everything I was beginning to understand. about the nature of divine love. An older Christian man stepped forward and addressed the small group of my brothers who remained. We don't want to pressure anyone or claim victory over what happened here today. We just want you to know that you're welcome to ask questions, to learn more about what you've witnessed. God's love is big enough for all of us. Standing up slowly, my legs still shaky from the intensity of my experience, I turned to face the crowd that had gathered to witness our demonstration. I came here today to burn books that I believed were threatening my faith. I announced, my voice carrying across the plaza. But I've learned that faith isn't something that needs to be defended with fire and anger. Real faith is strong enough to withstand questions, to engage with different ideas, to seek truth wherever it might be found. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and polarized. Some of the Muslims who had come to support our demonstration shook their heads in disappointment and began to leave. Others remained, clearly struggling to process what they had witnessed and what it might mean for their own understanding of faith and truth. The Christians present looked stunned but grateful, many of them openly weeping as they watched this unexpected turn of events. My declaration of newfound faith spread through our neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, my father had heard multiple versions of what had happened in the plaza, each telling slightly different but consistently shocking details about his son's public conversion to Christianity. When I arrived home that night, I found him sitting in his study, the same room where he had commissioned me to defend our faith just weeks earlier. The disappointment in his eyes was more painful than any physical blow could have been. Asif, he said quietly, not looking up from the Quran he held in his hands, tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. Tell me you haven't abandoned everything we raised you to believe. The hope in his voice made my heart break, knowing that my answer would cause him profound grief. Father, I haven't abandoned faith, I replied, carefully. I've found a deeper understanding of it. The God I met today, the God who protected those books from burning, He's the same God we've always worshipped. He's just bigger than we realized, more loving than we imagined, more inclusive than we were taught. My father's response was to ask me to leave his house until I came to my senses. I cannot have someone in my home who has rejected Islam, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. You are still my son, and I still love you, but I cannot support this path you've chosen. Come back when you're ready to return to your true faith. That night I found myself homeless but not hopeless, rejected by my family, but embraced by a new understanding of divine love that was bigger than any single religious tradition. The Christians from the plaza had offered to help me find temporary housing and to answer the thousands of questions that were flooding my mind about this new faith I was discovering. As I lay on a borrowed bed in a stranger's guest room, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in a single day. This morning, I had been a leader among young Muslim men, respected in my community, secure in my identity and beliefs. Tonight, I was essentially an exile, cut off from everything familiar, facing an uncertain future with only a handful of new friends and a profound spiritual experience to guide me forward. But despite the loss and uncertainty, I felt a peace that I had never experienced before. The same voice that had spoken to me in the plaza continued to whisper reassurance to my heart throughout that long first night of my new life as a follower of Jesus. The first Bible I ever read as a believer rather than an enemy was the same translation I had tried to burn that morning in the plaza. One of the Christians who had witnessed my conversion brought it to me that evening, and I spent the entire night reading the Gospel of Matthew with tears streaming down my face. Every page revealed new depths of the love I had encountered, every verse confirming what I had experienced in that supernatural moment of divine intervention. Learning about Jesus' teachings on love and forgiveness transformed my understanding of what faith was supposed to accomplish in a person's life. Where I had been taught to defend and fight, Jesus taught to love and serve. Where I had been instructed to view other religions as threats, Jesus demonstrated a love that transcended all human boundaries and prejudices. The Sermon on the Mount became my roadmap for rebuilding my entire approach to spiritual life. The most difficult lesson was learning to forgive those who had rejected me. After my conversion, my father's silence continued for 6 months, a period during which I experienced grief unlike anything I had ever known. Losing the approval and acceptance of the man whose respect had shaped my entire identity felt like losing a limb. But through prayer and study of Jesus' teachings, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just something I needed to receive, but something I needed to offer freely to others. I learned that God's power isn't demonstrated through protests, anger, or forcing others to believe what we believe. Real divine power is revealed through transformation, through the ability to love enemies, through the courage to serve those who have hurt us. The same energy I had once channeled into religious anger began flowing toward compassion and understanding for people from all faith backgrounds. 6 months after my conversion, my father finally agreed to see me. We met in a neutral location, a small cafe between our neighborhood and the area where I was now living with my new Christian friends. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, and I realized that my conversion had caused him as much pain as his rejection had caused me. "Son," he said quietly, stirring his tea without drinking it, "I have watched you over these months. I have heard reports about how you conduct yourself, how you treat others, how you speak about faith and God." He paused, meeting my eyes for the first time since our separation. "I don't understand your beliefs, and I still wish you would return to Islam. But I cannot deny that you have become a better man." That conversation marked the beginning of a slow healing process between us. My father never converted to Christianity, but he gradually accepted that my faith had produced good fruit in my life. We learned to discuss religious differences with respect rather than anger, and our relationship became stronger than it had ever been when we shared the same beliefs. My new Christian community embraced me with a patience and love that continued to amaze me. They never pressured me to abandon my cultural identity or to reject everything about my Islamic upbringing. Instead, they helped me understand how my background had prepared me to appreciate certain aspects of God's character in ways that people from Christian backgrounds might not naturally grasp. Within a year of my conversion, I felt called to work in interfaith dialogue and reconciliation. The very conflict that had once consumed me became the foundation for my ministry to others struggling with religious hatred and misunderstanding. I began speaking at churches, mosques, and community centers about the possibility of finding common ground without compromising core beliefs. The work was challenging because it required me to navigate between communities that often viewed each other with suspicion and fear, Muslims sometimes saw me as a traitor who had abandoned his faith for personal gain. Christians sometimes wondered if my conversion was genuine or if I might be a secret agent trying to infiltrate their churches. But gradually, people from both communities began to trust me as someone who understood their concerns from personal experience. I started distributing Bibles in the same neighborhood where I had once tried to burn them. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it felt like a necessary part of my redemption story. Every Bible I gave away was a small act of restitution for the destruction I had once planned. Many of the recipients were curious rather than hostile, especially after hearing about my dramatic conversion experience. Working with former extremists became another focus of my ministry. I discovered that many young men were following the same path of religious anger that I had traveled, motivated by the same mixture of sincere faith and misdirected zeal that had driven me to that plaza on May 8th, 2019. My story resonated with them because I could speak their language, understand their motivations, and offer an alternative path that honored their spiritual passion without requiring them to abandon it. Now I'm asking you to consider your own heart and motivations. Have you ever been so convinced that you were defending truth that you closed yourself off from the possibility that you might be wrong? Have you ever felt called to fight against something without first examining whether you were fighting against God Himself? Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether your religious convictions are producing love or anger, unity or division, peace or conflict. The fire I tried to light that day was nothing compared to the fire Jesus lit in my heart. The flames I attempted to kindle would have destroyed books and created more hatred between communities. The fire Jesus ignited within me has been burning for years now, producing warmth, light, and life everywhere it touches. It's a fire that doesn't consume what is valuable, but only burns away what is false and harmful. Today, 3 years later, I distribute the same Bibles I once tried to burn. I share the same message of God's love that I once opposed. I work for the same unity between peoples that I once sought to prevent. Every day is a reminder that God can transform anyone, redeem any situation, and bring good from even our most misguided intentions. If Jesus can transform someone who tried to burn his word into someone who now shares it with others, imagine what he can do in your life. If God can use a failed book burning to create a ministry of reconciliation, think about how he might want to use your own struggles and mistakes for purposes greater than you can imagine. Don't wait for your own miracle moment, though I pray you'll be open to recognizing it if it comes. Jesus is calling you right now, just as he called to me in that plaza, with the same love and patience he showed to someone who was actively working against him. The same God who protected those Bibles from my flames is ready to protect you from whatever forces are trying to destroy the good plans he has for your life.